Good afternoon, everyone. For the first lecture this afternoon, we all have the pleasure of hearing from Virginia Mecklenburg about the boundaries of culture and rainfall never follows survey lines. Texas art is American art. Texas artists represent the complexity reality we call America. In the 1930s, Alexandre Hogue turned the Dust Bowl's ravages into powerful paintings. And Jerry Bywaters tracked our role in the nation's industrialism. In the 1940s, Tom Lee painted wartime horrors, then sought healing in the West Texas landscape. In the 1980s, Jimenez affirmed the centrality of Latinx culture, and John Alexander satirized anxiety. Texas artists reflect our multidimensional national identity, even as they speak to our shared humanity. Virginia Mecklenburg, PhD, a native Texan, is a curator, writer, and lecturer who has organized exhibitions of Edward Hopper's watercolors, Norman Rockwell's paintings from George Lucas's and Steven Spielberg's collections, and most recently, Fighters for Freedom, William H. Johnson, Picturing Justice. She has written on African American and Latinx artists, George Bellows, Robert Indiana, Jesus Morales, and others for books and national magazines. She served as vice president of the College Art Association and on advisory committees for the Museum of Latin American Art, Reynolda House Museum, and the Sarah Roby Foundation. Mecklenburg holds a BA and MA from the University of Texas at Austin and a PhD from the University of Maryland. Please join us in welcoming Virginia Mecklenburg to the podium.
Hi, you all, y'all. And you think I should know because I was born in Dallas, but I only just recently learned that the plural of y'all is all y'all. Anyway, thank you all so much for the opportunity to be here today. I've never been to a Caseta conference before, but the first time should never be the last, is what I have to say. I want to do a special shout out to Michael Grauer, and to Mary Alice Chirito, Bonnie Campbell, for inviting me to come and being patient when I missed all of the deadlines for sending the materials. And I especially want to thank our tech guru, Nick Pierce, who is bailing all of us out. Thinking about Texas art, Michael said, well, you should talk about Texas art as American art. Well, my first reaction was, duh, of course it is. But it's given me the opportunity to think about this iconic place that I've always called home. We were a military family, so I never got to live here until my dad came when I was a sophomore in college, I guess. And they finally, after living all sorts of places, we moved back to Texas, and it was a revelation. I've learned so much from reading Michael's work, and that of Ron Tyler, Rick Stewart, Susie Khalil, Sam Ratcliffe. Are you here, Sam? Shout out to Sam. The work of Sharon Udall, who's written brilliantly on O'Keeffe and Texas, and listening to the talks that I've heard last night, yours, Sue, last night, and the ones this morning. The work of you all and so many other scholars really probes, what can I say? You probe history, but you illuminate it with your insights, and for that I am deeply grateful. I also want to say a special thank you to Luis Jimenez, Jesus Morales, and Dallas collector Frank Ribelin. Did any of you know Frank? All of them gone now, but who became, in this journey we call a life in art history, became very dear friends. Now, in 1990, now this is the Smithsonian, the facade of the Smithsonian what's now called the Smithsonian American Art Museum. We were looking for a sculpture that could hold its own in front of the very impressive but also quite daunting neoclassical facade of our building. Andrew Jackson laid the cornerstone for this building, so we're talking ancient history here. We needed something big, and we needed something memorable. And we wanted to send a signal that the Museum of American Art welcomed everyone who could climb the steps or make their way up the ramp at least. I mean, that's one of the troubles with Greek temple architecture. You gotta climb up there to get to it. Vaquero was the perfect choice. It's a 16-foot tall sculpture of a cowboy. You know, what's more American than a cowboy? Especially one that's made of fiberglass resin and painted with sparkly, high-gloss colors that were developed for the automobile industry. Think boats and low riders. In other words, an equestrian sculpture that updated the myth of the tradition of equestrian sculpture. Well, Luis's Mexican cowboy, and you can see him, he came to Washington from time to time, and so we always had him pose for a picture in front of Vaquero. So that's Luis in front of Vaquero on our front steps. Luis's Mexican cowboy brandishing a six-shooter points to the country's polyglot origins, but it's also more. Luis described it as a sculpture in the tradition of Verrocchio and the other great Renaissance masters of equestrian sculpture. Plus, you know, he had this wonderful, quirky sense of humor. He loved the idea of his Mexican cowboy joining the pantheon of generals on horseback that populate parks all over the city. He also loved the aesthetic that he learned as a kid, working in his father's neon sign in El Paso, would, pop art style, connect Chicano history. Are we saying Chicanx here? Or are we still doing Chicano and Chicana? Anyway, connect Chicanx history with the long and distinguished tradition of great art. Well, you know, the United States has always valued symbolism. In the early years of the Republic, we defined ourselves in terms of precedents. The Constitution is based on Greco-Roman prototypes. And when we began to construct buildings to house our young republic, it made sense that we use Greek and Roman architectural sources. But how to signal that the fledgling United States wasn't Greece or Rome? So we inflected our buildings with distinctly American motifs. Instead of acanthus leaves for the Corinthian capitals inside the Capitol building, sculptors crafted corn cobs. You can see here. There are also tobacco leaves, but I couldn't find a good picture of the tobacco that was recognizable. To signal that this was also a new place, a place that had possibilities that were unique to the New World. Okay. Well, somewhere or other I dropped a slide that shows one of Bierstadt's majestic tall redwood paintings and the Smithsonian American Art Museum's fabulous Thomas Moran Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone. These paintings were done as showpieces. The artists went out on expedition, did oodles of sketches, brought the sketches back, and then painted these magnificent canvases back in their studios in the East. The paintings did a couple of different things. One is they made a lot of money for the artists because, you know, they tour them around the country or around the East Coast, and people would pay whatever, 25 cents, maybe 50 for a really big painting, so that they could come in and see this spectacle. But they also showed, and particularly Thomas Moran's, because he was absolutely meticulous in the way that he painted so that geologists could figure out what the rock formations were. People who knew about plants could see what grew there. So the possibilities for agriculture, mining, commerce that was held in the West became apparent to people through their paintings. Now, this is the right one. So what's Texas? What does it look like? Well, as you all know only too well, and I learned, sort of inside my soul when I drove from Dallas, well, the whole family drove from Dallas to Dimmitt. You all know where Dimmitt is? Out Lubbock, Amarillo direction. when my brother was ordained as a minister. He was being ordained in Dimmitt. Baptist churches locally ordain their new ministers. So, we got in the car one morning and drove and drove and drove, and eventually, sort of late in the afternoon, we finally got to Dimmitt. Texas is a huge place, so it's many things. It's the bluebonnet fields of Onderdonk, the empty expanses of Frank Ray's West Texas, the craggy landscapes of Jerry Bywaters' Big Bend. You see his cactus in Big Bend right there on the right. The marshlands of Herb Booth's Gulf Coast. And it's also the skyscrapers that rise from our cities and the oil fields that have brought great prosperity. I went to the University of Texas when the tuition was still $50 a semester. I paid more for my textbooks, but the land grant oil made it possible for anybody to go who was able to, I think they let everybody in those days. Texas is also the people whose lives and cultures make us all richer for their diversity. They are the men who frequent the bait shop that David Bates, I love this, he calls the painting Bates, called A Place Where Real Folks Are. They're the father and daughter watching a 4th of July parade in early Hudnall's photograph called The Guardian. They're the independent young women in Jerry Bywaters' Oil Field Girls. I think there's probably a lot more to say about that painting, but I won't do it now. And the close-knit band of brothers that Jesse Trevino, who was a Vietnam War veteran, called his family. And of course, the Dallas Cowboys. Can't leave out the Dallas Cowboys. The early Texas artists, you all know a whole lot more about this stuff than I do, so I'm really telling you nothing new. But they weren't solitary figures wandering around Texas painting whatever it was they saw. Frank Ray studied at the School of Fine Arts in St. Louis and spent time at the Académie Julienne in Paris. That was a big deal. He passed what he knew along to Eisenlohr, to Revo Bassett, to Alexandre Hogue, and even to my great-aunt, Abigail Crane, who went on his sketching trips too. Onderdonk had studied at the National Academy of Design in New York and at the Art Students League, and with William Merritt Chase. He was one of the great luminaries in American art, late 19th, early years of the 20th century, and who had a school at Shinnecock Hills in New York, in Long Island. So these we call them early Texas artists, but they are these early Texas artists were skilled, they were sophisticated. They were painters who showed their work in New York, Chicago, Cincinnati. They were truly artists to be reckoned with in the national arena. Frank Ray and you'll hear about Frank Ray. I can't say much about him with the world's leading expert sitting in the front row. But Ray had a studio and art school here in Oak Cliff. But his material, of course, came from sketching trips he took with his students to West Texas. I think it's no accident that the Texas mystique of wide open spaces where longhorn cattle roam the range took hold in the American imaginary. Ray's images, along with the writings of author and newspaper columnist J. Frank Dobie, pretty much came to define Texas. Dobie's books, he had huge coverage. In fact, that sort of weird title for my talk, that's a J. Frank Dobie quote. I'll find a better one next time. So Dobie's books, A Vaquero in the Brush Country, Coronado's Children, and especially The Longhorns, which Tom Lee illustrated, along with romanticized novels about cowboys and subsequently all of the Western movies that came out of Hollywood, associated Texas in the American mind with the wide open spaces of West Texas. Michael quotes a wonderful passage in his book on Ray that describes the O Ranch Roundup. He talks about the vastness of the land where literally thousands of cattle are being rounded up, and it mentions the incredibly highly organized way that the roundup was conducted, which was actually enlightening to me. I thought they just, herded cattle. Bywaters, West Texas Dusk. Can you all see the inscriptions on the slides well enough to know what they are? Anyway, the view of these artists persisted in decades that followed. Bywaters, of course, lived in Dallas, taught at SMU, and was director of the DMA. One of the great regrets of my life is when I started at SMU, I was in pre-med, so I was taking chemistry and biology and that kind of stuff. Jerry Bywaters was there, and I didn't have a clue. Anyway, but he traveled to West Texas, Big Bend, and was also tuned into modern and modernist movements. As director at DMA, he borrowed artworks and brought in exhibitions from the Metropolitan Museum and the Museum of Modern Art in New York. There's a great photograph of Bywaters sitting with Francis Henry Taylor, the director of the Metropolitan Museum. I think it's in your book, isn't it, Sam? Anyway, yeah, I mean, it's a great picture. These two look like co-conspirators in some sort of plan. Tom Lee, working, of course, in El Paso, also carried the legacy forward. He painted Southwest in 1956, and I'm proud to say that the Smithsonian American Art Museum owns the it's not even a preliminary study, it's a small version of it. It's a mural that Lee gave to the El Paso Public Library. You know, on one hand, it looks like a realistic rendering of the landscape. On the other, it reflects his profound understanding of the pictorial modernist, can I say that, Katie? Modernist pictorial principles, and particularly those of Cézanne. But probably the most dramatic and really early fusion of landscape with what came to be understood as American modern comes in Georgia O'Keeffe's early watercolors. She spent 2 years teaching in the Amarillo school system and another 2 years heading up the art department at West Texas State University in Canyon. That was from 1916 to 1918 she was there. She was in absolute awe of the endless prairie and the infinite skies of West Texas. She said later, "I lived on the plains of North Texas for 4 years. It is the only place I ever felt I really belonged. It was my country, with terrible winds and wonderful emptiness. The evening star would be high in the sunset sky when it was still broad daylight. That evening star fascinated me. It was, in some ways, very exciting. I had nothing but to walk into nowhere and the wide sunset space with the star." The contours of Palo Duro Canyon, lightning storms on the plains, sunset colors, all had a really powerful effect that ultimately shaped O'Keeffe's work, I think, for the rest of her life. You know, these early watercolors in a group of charcoal drawings that one of her friends sent them to Alfred Stieglitz and said, you know, you really ought to see these things. Stieglitz didn't know who she was, and he looked at them and said, at last, a woman on paper. That ended up being the beginning of what became a beautiful and sometimes not so beautiful relationship. But you can see here the Chama River, which is the image on the left, was painted in 1935, and it's fairly descriptive as O'Keeffe could make it. The one on the right was painted 30 years later. It's just called Blue River. But notice how the forms in this much flatter perspective, the forms of the blue reflect very much the forms of the Chama River that she painted and that, you know, one could recognize. Well, the 30s, of course, was a horrific time for everyone in the United States. The Dust Bowl destroyed agriculture across the Great Plains, and the Great Depression threw millions of people out of work all across the country. Alexandre Hogue, more than anyone, captured the ravaged landscape, the landscape that was eroded and depleted by the storms that swept the plains. He was another very sophisticated artist. And I think he particularly understood the power of the visual image from having worked in advertising in New York. Through contemporary photographs and his paintings, one of which I show you on the right, this dust storm coming, Americans truly came to understand what the Dust Bowl meant. In fact, the June 21, 1937 issue of Life magazine, which a newly established pictorial magazine, that was a huge hit from the get-go, reproduced Hogue's paintings with the headline, quote, "The U.S. Dust Bowl, colon, its artist is a Texan portraying man's mistakes," which of course talks about, the plow that, that part. For his part, Hogue spoke of, quote, "the tragedy of the situation, whose effects were beautiful, but in a terrifying way." Both Dorothea Lange and Jerry Bywaters captured the human tragedy that resulted. Lange, in her photograph, Texas farmer in California, looking for work for himself and his family, and Bywaters in the grim face of his 1936 painting, Sharecropper, which I confess I absolutely covet that painting. And just sort of coincidentally, several months back, I read a book, never heard about it before, that is the story of a woman on a West Texas farm with 2 little children who ends up, because there's no water, there's no food, eventually they try to wait it out, and eventually they go to California, where things weren't quite as hard, but almost, and in very different ways. The book is by a woman named Kristen Hanna, and it's called The Four Winds. If you ever find a moment when you really need something, it's not exactly bedtime reading, but it's hard to put it down once you start. In 1933, the newly elected President Franklin Roosevelt attempted to come to the rescue with his New Deal programs. The first one that was set up for artists was a pilot program called the Public Works of Art Project. Although it only lasted 6 months, it started in mid-December of 1933 and ran through the spring, it paid thousands of artists to do paintings and sculpture. In fact, Patty Richardson's oil refinery, Fort Worth, is one of the paintings that was featured in a show. They were, to make everything palatable for Congress, that art really could do something useful, they had a huge show of several thousand works at the Corcoran Gallery in Washington, Capitol buildings just down the street. They didn't want the funding to be cut because it was such an important thing that artists were not going to get plumbers' jobs, so they needed to be able to do what they did. Well, Frances Perkins, who was the Secretary of Labor, first woman cabinet secretary, selected Richardson's painting for permanent display at the Department of Labor. So we're lucky we have it. We're very lucky we have it. A second program commissioned murals for post offices and federal courthouses around the country. The post office murals were intended to reflect the ideas, the history, the aspirations of people in small and medium-sized communities. And with few exceptions, they weren't installed unless the local people approved of them. Sometimes the local officials was a postmaster, sometimes a librarian or a group of people, sometimes a mayor. The painting had to pass local muster before it could get glued permanently, almost permanently, onto post office walls. Post office murals generally portrayed positive images, scenes of early settlers, founding fathers, productive industry, and fertile agriculture. Jerry Bywaters did the Houston Ship Channel for the Houston Parcel Post building. It shows productive commerce. On the left is equipment and valves and stuff that I think are associated with shipping oil. On the right, all of those stacked up things, I'm not sure what they are. I wonder if they're tiny bales of cotton. That's what I thought. That's what I thought because, there's a big cotton industry in East and Southeast Texas. But I have to tell you, these paintings, like 130 or 40 post office murals, got thrown out. And a guy who worked at the National Gallery of Art in Washington on a Sunday afternoon was driving past the General Services Administration building and saw all these paintings piled up beside the dumpster. So he screeched to a halt, put as many of them as he could in the back of his station wagon. Well, fortunately, his wife taught at the University of Maryland, so he raced home, unloaded all these things, and said, "You have to take them to your art gallery at the university." And he went back and got another load. When I was a graduate student there, one of my assignments was to sort through all of this stuff. I mean, a lot of it unlabeled, you had no idea what it was for, and in fact, it was weeks after I had started looking through this stuff that I realized that this painting and this painting were two halves of the Houston Ship Channel. So we were able to get conservation gun and reunite the two sides of Bywaters' image. Jenny Magafan won the commission to do a mural for the Anson, Texas post office. It was a national competition, so it was a big deal for her to win. She decided to do an image in which contemporary ranchers celebrated their forefathers by dressing up in old-timey clothes and having a hoedown. So this is the design that she submitted to the competition. It's terrific, it's lively, engaging, but she ran into a little snag. Between the time she did this study and the time she finished the final mural, she decided it needed a little something. So she added a jug in the lower right corner, down there, and painted it in, and that took the mural to Anson to be installed. Well, the people were absolutely outraged. Anson, of course, as well as the rest of Texas, was dry. And the people were horrified that anyone would think that they would indulge in demon liquor at their parties. A couple of other mural studies. Julius Waltz's Coronado's Exploration Party in Palo Duro Canyon, and Tom Lee's Pass of the North, which is, I think, one of his most famous images. Dozens of Texas artists received commissions. Waltz chose an imaginary, he imagined a historical scene for the Amarillo, Texas post office. This early, quotes, historical scene shows conflict among early inhabitants. Well, they could get away with that because it was historical. It was not a positive image, exactly. But he also, I think, got away with it because the scene is set in this absolutely spectacular West Texas landscape. Tom Lee's mural for the El Paso Courthouse, Pass of the North, shows the many contributors, conquistadors, settlers, Native Americans, a Franciscan friar, and others, whose disparate beliefs and cultures came together to form what would become El Paso. Lee, I might say, was he did, I haven't tried to count up, but he did probably 14 or 16 murals and mural cycles that were sponsored by the New Deal. The whole sequence of paintings in St. Louis he did, and probably one of the most affecting, I couldn't find a photograph of it, is a painting called The Nesters that he did for the post office department building, the cabinet level building structure in Washington, D.C. So that was a hugely prestigious commission. It's a beautiful painting. I almost got the two sides, I had to scan it from a book, I almost got the two sides lined up too. Warren Hunter presented a medley, sort of a collage of images associated with local industry in the mural he did for Alice, Texas. South Texas Panorama shows a range of people whose roles are identifiable by the clothing that they wear. At the right are community leaders. These folks over there reading the paper. At the left, lower left down here, are skilled workers, welders and construction workers, adjacent to the things, pipelines and houses and things that would have been the fruits of their work. Ranching is, up here you can see cattle going into a train car, and a wagon full of recently harvested cotton is at the upper center. Everyone is cast in a role. Note especially that the people associated with the cotton industry wear sombreros. And what piques my feminist side, the sole woman in the figure is there, has a little child reaching up. She's right there. And she's ringing, one of those triangles that you see people in the movies ringing for the dinner bell. So it clarifies, and in some ways, I don't know, maybe even, it confirms the hierarchical social roles that were played in different parts of Texas, in different parts of the country. And in case you were wondering, the white rectangle here, the painting was designed to go on the end wall of the post office, and the postmaster's door would have been in the middle. So that, you didn't paint that in, you just left a space, because that's where the door would be. Now, I want to skip ahead a couple of decades, because this whole idea of communities and sort of social arrangements is key to particularly a lot of narrative art. The 1960s and beyond was a period of cultural affirmation and also social protests as the civil rights movement took center stage. Carmen Lomas Garza, Luis Jimenez, Dalila Montoya, Rudy Fernandez, and so many others affirmed the centrality of Chicano culture within the American mainstream. Often, I might add, with the support of Dallas collector Frank Ribelin, who was, Carmen Lomas Garza's small paintings, the pieces are small, some of them are prints, some of them gouache, show ordinary episodes in the lives of Mexican Americans in South Texas. They speak to family and community and the transmission of culture from one generation to the next. Camas para Sueños speaks to the dreams of the young that are nurtured by their parents. Carmen shows herself and her sister relaxing on the roof of their house in Kingsville. They look at the moon and dream about becoming artists. Below, their mother sort of actually and metaphorically makes the bed, creating the place and the space that will allow them to pursue their dreams. Loteria Tabla Llena, which shows family and friends on the right, even the little kids, notice back here, they're little kids, It's not an adult group, it's a family group. They gather around a table to play Loteria. It's a bingo-like game, and it reinforces cultural connections, because each square on the lottery card has an image related to some aspect of daily life or some cultural signifier. So instead of simply calling out numbers as bingo callers do, the announcer calls out the associated pictures, often using some sort of a humorous or wise saying to identify the squares that are supposed to be covered up with your little bingo thing. Lomas Garza's mother painted Loteria cards, so this image is also a tribute to her mother. John Banks, a Texas sort of visionary self-taught artist, did paintings of slave auctions and also of Juneteenth celebration. It's a community gathering too, looks like fun. Musicians down at the lower right, there's a barbecue over at the left, that sort of amorphic green space in the background, people are playing baseball, and there is lots of food on the table and more coming. So, although Banks created a contemporary scene, he references an historical moment, the day the word of the Emancipation Proclamation that freed Southern slaves finally reached Texas, some 2.5 years after the proclamation was issued. And it's now a national holiday. Get your barbecue tongs ready, it's coming up next week. And Banks said a lot of his paintings come from stories and sort of histories, oral histories that he learned from his grandmother. I also want to show you this, which is one of my all-time favorite paintings in the world. John Bigger's Shotgun, 3rd Ward, number 1. It's truly it's an image of community, but it's also an image of pathos and loss. Neighbors are gathering in the street to watch the smoldering remains of their church. Each one to the scene brings a different perspective. The kids are playing in the water, oblivious that there's a tragedy. The woman with the baby at the right turns her head away. The central figure of the woman, the largest figure in the composition, the woman in pink that we see from the back, seems a true pillar of strength. But even with this devastation, there is a tiny glimmer of hope. The clergyman who faces our way, here and here, holds a small lantern that protects the flame, and he protects the flame with his hand. He, and certainly the woman in the pink dress, will not let the light of their church or of their community go out. I looked to see if there had been a rash of church burnings before Biggers did this, but I don't know, Encyclopedia or somebody did a list of church burnings in the South, and there were only one or two that happened in the 50s before Biggers painted this painting. They mostly came, they were in Mississippi, Alabama, one was in Richmond, Virginia, but they mostly came after that. So it would make a nice, neat civil rights story to say that's what prompted Biggers' paintings, but I don't know that that's true. I think it probably isn't. There's probably another backstory that we still need to find out. Historical places within Texas. Tony Gleaton, photographer, was not from Texas, but the idea of discovering and affirming racial and cultural histories that crossed or ignored boundaries was a central theme in his work. In 1999, he began traveling the country west of the Mississippi River in a quest to document the experiences of African Americans. He was especially looking to excavate histories and people whose stories had mostly been lost, people for whom a place was pretty much the only remaining signifier. Pecos River, just north of its confluence with the Rio Bravo de Norte with Mexico in the distance, is the title of the piece on the left. It's a stunningly beautiful landscape. But for Gleason, the point of the picture was to commemorate Black Seminole Scouts John Ward and Pompey Factor, who were awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor for saving the life of one Lieutenant John Bullis during an 1875 skirmish that took place in the river bottom. Goliad Mission on the right is where, during the lead up to the Texas Revolution, is where a freed black man named Samuel McCulloch was severely wounded in the war of Texas against Santa Anna. McCulloch was the only Texan wounded in the battle, and he became known as the first Texan casualty of the 1836 Revolution. Sort of reminds me of the Crispus Attucks, but of Texas, not of Boston, U.S. fame. Well, I expect many of you knew Jesus Morales, who was tragically killed in a car crash in 2015. Jesus created monumental granite sculptures. I mean, there's the one in New York near the Museum of Modern Art, I think it was a Payne-Weber commission maybe, is like 30, 40 feet high. I can't even imagine how many tons of granite that is. But his work is in public spaces and museums and private collections literally all over the world. He uses granite because the stone originates deep in the earth, and because he said it embodies really the human urge for timelessness. He began doing what he called weaving granite. It's not woven, actually, it's chinked together in the late 1980s. This sculpture, which is in our collection, the result of the first time I met Jesus, that's another story. If we have time, I'll tell you. It reads like the wall of a stepped pyramid. So it recalls ancient prototypes, structures found in Mexico, Mesopotamia, maybe even Egypt. The vertical slabs on either side support the structure. And these are in turn, then there are these cross bars, if you will, of granite. And within those, it's, I think, a little hard to see, maybe quite hard to see. in between the whole back of the space is filled in with these little squares that are about this big and about that deep, and so it's all chinked in. Jesus felt a really strong kinship with pre-Columbian Mesoamericans, but he also talked about Renaissance art, modern sculptors. Isamu Noguchi, he said, had left a real mark on his soul. I mean, Jesus's legacy, in my view, is incalculable. Have many of you all seen the Houston Police Memorial? I have not ever seen it. It's one of my bucket list major things that I need to do. He brought Chinese sculptors who had no wherewithal. He brought them to his studio in Cerrillos. It was an old WPA school complex that he rebuilt. He brought them there, provided transportation, lodging, food. This is not a wealthy man, but somebody who was so committed to art as an international phenomenon, to this kind of bond that is truly our humanity. So that's what he did. And in 2008, the photo at the upper left is Jesus at work in his studio in Rockport. And below that, George W. Bush is awarding Jesus the National Medal of Art. It was one of the great honors of my life when Jesus invited my husband and me to join him and his family for dinner after the award ceremony. I still am a little bit. Now, so what is this legacy? If I'm allowed to stray a little bit beyond the early Texan parameters of Caseta, I wanted to show you a couple of works that seem to me to embody the ideas and the ethos of early Texas artists. I can't help but think about Robert Glenn's Mustangs in Las Colinas. They're wonderful. If you haven't seen them, go take a look. They're nearby. They frolic and play. I mean, there is nothing that's holding these amazing animals back. I think Donald John reinforces the sense of wide open space with these are just some of the concrete squares, whatever, that he has spaced in this field in Marfa. James Turrell's skyscapes, they resonate, I think, with Georgia O'Keeffe. So, and Gabriel Dawes' ephemeral sculptures, they're made out of threads, strings, that capture light, air. This is an installation. We used this piece of Gabriel's as the centerpiece for a show called Wonder that we put up to reopen our Renwick Gallery, which is a space across the street from the White House. So what do you think? Texas art? American art? Great. Can I have two more? Okay. Well, after listening to last night's and this morning's talks, I thought I might be a little skimpy. I put the Smithsonian American Art Museum name without the full credits on the pieces that were in this PowerPoint that the museum owns. But there was so much that I couldn't talk about, and I feel like sort of a cheat because I didn't say anything ever about Tom Lee's war paintings that are fabulous and devastating. So I ran up at lunchtime just to show you a couple more things that we have by people whom you probably know. So John Alexander, on the left, a painting called Living Your Life in a Goldfish Bowl, which was this kind of chaotic sense that he had shortly after moving to New York, and then a very pointed painting called Ship of Fools. James Searles. James, much as I like the flower, the axe and the wand for me is the piece. It hangs from the ceiling. This is not a great photograph of it, but I hate to talk about an artist's work when he's sitting right there, but it's like a tree root or something that it has come out of. And this figure with a birdhouse on the top for the head is holding an axe and carrying a wand. I mean, we don't have enough time to really talk about that one. And I wanted to show you this sculpture by Melvin Edwards. It's not one of the Lynch fragments. It's called Tambo. It was done as a tribute to Oliver Tambo, who ran the African National Congress for years when everybody else was in jail. And I've written about this at greater length, but it's, when you take it apart, not physically, but metaphorically, you see implements for building, implements for welding, creating, but also in this little vase-like thing, this is all found stuff that's welded together, in this little vase-like thing, there is a highly polished, highly sharpened spear. So as a country moves forward, as a person moves forward, you're prepared. You're prepared to grow and build, and also to defend if the need arises. And lastly, if you'll indulge me in one little story. This is about 10 feet wide, maybe, multiple pieces of paper that is a drawing in advance of Luis Jimenez's Southwest Pietà. I noticed that there is a Southwest Pietà on a lowrider on one of the prints. Anyway, this drawing was in a show at the Hirshhorn Museum, just about 6 blocks from where my place is. And I love this drawing. I mean, it's just magical. And so I'd gone back 4 or 5 times to look at it, and then realized that the show was closing and it was going to be shipped back to Luis. He owned it. It cost $10,000, and that was a lot of money in those days. So I bit the bullet and called up my friend Frank Ribelin. And I said, "Oh, Frank, I can send you a photograph of it, but this is this most amazing sculpture, or most amazing drawing, and it's after the sculpture, and it's an iconic image for Luis, da-da-da-da-da-da." And before I even finished talking, he said, "Well, hell, honey, I think if you want it, you should have it. Have him send it over." So thank you for listening and being such a great audience. And do come to Washington. The Smithsonian American Art Museum has very convenient hours, 11:30 in the morning till 7 o'clock at night, so you don't even have to get up early to come by. Sure.